Please be sure to subscribe to the Bill Houston Podcast on YouTube and donate generously to support my work.
It is an extreme pleasure for me to introduce Richard D. Wolff, who is a professor of economics emeritus of University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University in New York. He also teaches classes regularly at the Brecht Forum in Manhattan. He's also taught economics at Yale University and at the City College in New York. Since 2011, Professor Wolff has hosted a weekly radio program, Economic Update. Begun on a single Pacifica station in March 2011, it's now regularly played on 50 stations nationwide, including our own local station, WRFI. Professor Wolff's specialty on his program is to take complex economic issues and make them understandable, empowering listeners with information to analyze not only our own financial situation, but the economy at large. By focusing on the economic dimensions of everyday life, wages, jobs, taxes, debts, interest rates, prices, and profits, his program explores alternative ways to organize markets and government policies. It's my great pleasure to introduce Richard D. Wolff.
Can everybody hear me all right? Good. Thank you all for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. And I'm going to now try to do the best I can to make sure you don't regret the decision to come out here on a Saturday. I'm going to start by very briefly telling you what you already know as the way to get into my talking to you about another and a new way of doing business in the world that I think is a way out of the mess that the world economic system has gotten itself into. So let me begin with what you know. A few weeks ago, the most important organization in the world that keeps track of income inequality in the world, it's a British group called Oxfam, O-X-F-A-M. And by the way, if you're interested, just Google them and you can find out all that they're doing in the reports that they produce. They study world inequality. And they issued their annual report, and here's what they found. The 62, I kid you not, you couldn't make up what I'm about to tell you. The 62 richest individuals in the world, most of whom are Americans, not all, but most of whom are Americans. The 62 richest people in the world, you know some of their names, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, folks like that. They together, these 62 people, so we're talking about a group of people much smaller than what are gathered in this room today. The 62 richest people in the world together have more wealth than half of the population of the planet. That's 3.5 billion people. We today have 7 billion people on this planet. The 3.5 half, the poorer half, together have less wealth than the 62 richest individuals. You have to go back to the ancient pharaohs of Egypt to find anything like that. This is an ethical, moral, economic disaster. Let me remind you, in case you're not up on this, that the lower half of the population, the 3.5 billion at the bottom half, those are the people that are regularly dying of diseases that are perfectly curable. Those are the people who don't have enough to eat, whose children die in the first year of life because they can't get the most elementary medical care that is required. They're the people who suffer every conceivable physical and mental affliction. If we took half of what the richest 62 had, we would transform the lives of 3.5 billion people. How in the world do you justify such a thing? How can you imagine that an economic system of which I can say what I just said is not thereby immediately disqualified from having a right to continue another minute, let alone another year? Let me go at this in another way. 2 weeks ago, a courageous individual, or perhaps a well-paid one, exposed the papers of an obscure law firm located in Panama. It's now becoming known as the Panama Papers. What's it about? Somebody working somewhere, or perhaps a computer hacker, who knows, went in and got millions of documents of this law firm. What this law firm does is create what are called shell companies. These are phony corporations, phony in the sense that they don't produce a good or a service, and they don't hire anybody. They're just there to create a number of layers between the people who own something and what you can see on the street being done with what they own, land or a factory or anything. So if you look at who owns that, you learn it's the Joe Smith Corporation. And when you say, well, who owns that? It turns out it's the Harry Jones Corporation. And when you study that, it turns out it's you get the picture, you create one company after another whose job is simply to own another company. So it becomes impossible to figure out who owns it. Now, who makes use of this? Anybody who has a reason to hide that he or she is the owner of something. So right off the bat, you know that everybody engaged in a criminal activity of any kind in the world needs to do this, so that the money being made in the criminal operation can't be traced to them and then they be held responsible. So this is a way to hide criminal money. But much more important is it's a way to hide money from the tax authorities in any country, because nobody can figure out, the tax authorities can't find out who you ultimately tax, because you don't have to declare it because no one can trace it to you. So you don't announce half your income because you know the government here in America or anywhere else can't find that you are in fact the owner, because they can't get through the 27 companies that have been phonied up in different countries and so on. And the law firm in Panama did all that for you. Among its biggest clients were HSBC, Union Bank Switzerland, Credit Suisse, and other monster companies who regularly use these law firms to help their rich clients. And for those of you that are not familiar with any of this, that means that you're not very rich, which may not come as a surprise to many of you, but it is another way to get at that sad reality. You're not in that club. Well, how much money is involved? Well, we have an answer. We're lucky. There's a professor at the University of California in Berkeley named Gabriel Zucman, Z-U-C-M-A-N, if any of you are interested. And that's what he studies. And he wrote a book that was released about a year ago, and he had a clever title. Instead of using Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, he entitled his book The Hidden Wealth of Nations. And he's a student of all of this sort of thing. His estimate is about $8 trillion is hidden. There are estimates that make it 2 to 3 times that. Well, now, why is this interesting? Well, many reasons. I don't have the time, so I'm just going to give you one. If $8 trillion are escaping taxation, and Panama, by the way, is not the only country that does that. We do that here in the United States. For those of you not familiar, we have a number of states in the United States. New York is not one of them, but a number of states where you can set up a corporation and no one can ever figure out who's behind it. Delaware is a great leader. So is Nevada, Wyoming, the Dakotas, for reasons that aren't so hard to figure out. It's a way of business for them. If you were to tax the trillions of dollars, Overnight, in the United States and other countries, all of the arguments about why we have to lay off public school teachers and other public employees, why we have to cut back services to the people, all of those arguments would evaporate because the taxes would be there. And who would they be taxes on? The criminals and the tax evaders among the richest people in our community. So what's all this austerity talk that Europe and America are so full of? The argument is, there's just not the money there. But of course the money's there. Not only is the money there, but we know exactly where it is. It's in Panama and Delaware and all the other places, Cayman Islands and Switzerland. You all know, kind of, don't you? And you know what is interesting about all the places? They don't have any armies or navies or air forces. You know how long it would take the United States to go there and make sure we get our hands on all this wealth? It would take 6, maybe 7 minutes. And it wouldn't cost anything. And it would pay for itself real quickly by what we would be able to get our hands on. Half of that is ill-gotten money in the first place, and none of it is paying taxes. My goodness. It turns out, if you think about it, that we don't have the economic problems we talk about and suffer from. Or to put it differently, it's just a matter of political will and determination. The technical problem of solving our economic difficulties are all easy. There's no technical problem at all. It's just a political problem. It's a question of what governs the way people think and act politically. Now, I want you to stay with that thought with me, please, as I move to another topic, which is what I want to talk with you about today, which is about the way we organize work. The process of going to work, interacting with the other people in the office or the store or the factory where we earn our livings. Now, we have those organized in a particular way in our society, overwhelmingly. And that way has a name. It's the capitalist way of organizing business. Most of the business in this country is done by a form of business called the corporation. It's very important that you all are with me on this, because there's a lot of mythology. The mythology of America, for example, is that the small business is the backbone of our economy. It's a very nice story. I understand why it's appealing. I like small businesses. I prefer them. But the business of America is done by corporations. Too bad, but it is the case. How does it work? Bear with me a moment to remind you. Corporations are owned usually by shareholders, people who buy shares in a company. A share is a piece of the ownership of an enterprise, a corporation. For those of you who don't know, 1% of shareholders own about 2/3 of all the shares, okay? So shareholding is highly concentrated in the United States. A tiny number of shareholders own the bulk of the shares. Why is that important? Besides obviously explaining why and how they're rich. Well, the answer is how a corporation is governed. The governing body of a corporation is called a board of directors. Usually 12 to 20 people who make all the basic decisions. They decide what the corporation produces. They decide how it produces the technology. They decide where the production occurs, and they decide what to do with the profits that the enterprise generates. So they have all the big power, these 12 to 20 people. How do you get to be on the board of directors? I can see some of you perking up right away. It's a matter of personal interest. You get elected by the shareholders. That's how it works. Every year in a corporation, there's an election. Every year there's an election. And you get one vote for every share you own. So, for example, if you own 10 million shares, because you inherited them from your grandmother, which is a lucky grandmother, and even you are more lucky than and she passed on. She left you the million shares or the 10 million shares. That's how many votes you get, 10 million. If your grandmother was more limited in her wealth and left you 11 shares, well, then you get 11 votes. Or if you're like most Americans and you have no shares, well, that's how many votes you get. None, zilch, zero. So it turns out that the major shareholders, having the bulk of the shares, elect the board of directors of all the corporations. You, unless there's some unusual folks here in our midst, your share of the power over this group of people is, I'll use a technical term, nothing. Okay? Zilch. That's really very interesting, because a corporation can have 100 workers or 1,000 workers or 10,000 or 100,000, and we have all those kinds in our society. All those people who work in the corporation, they have to live with the results of what the board of directors does. I'm going to go through that with you in a moment. But their influence over these decisions that affect them, nothing. You know, if you live with the results of decisions over which you have no power, that's called the opposite of democracy. That's like medieval time when the king would decide everything that happened, and you lived with the results of the king decisions, but your influence on the king was exactly the following. When he passed in the street, you bent over and doffed your hat. Other than that, you had no role to play. The whole notion of democracy was to stop that, to say that if there was a decision that you were affected by, you therefore had the right to participate in it. That's why we vote for, let's say, the mayor of the town, because the mayor has the decisions that he can take that affect you, and if he or she makes those decisions, you ought to have some input, so we have a vote where you could at least express something in the way of influence on this character. But when we go to work in a capitalist system, we give all that up. It's not there. You cross the threshold into your workplace, your office, your store, your factory, you are entering anti-democratic territory. You give it up. You may not have been aware of it, and that's of course not an accident, because had you been aware of it, crossing into that threshold would be even more unpleasant than it already is. And you kind of all do know it, don't you? You know that there's something wrong at the workplace. You always have, not every one of you, and perhaps not every day, but I'm not stretching it to suggest that many of you have had this vague sense after working all day in your factory or your office or your store that you've been getting, I don't know, ripped off. There's a reason that people work all day and then on the way home stop at a certain location to engage in something not so accidentally called the happy hour. To drive home the point that the previous hours weren't. And part of the reason they weren't is because you are in an undemocratic space, even though you've been trained to believe from day one that you were a member of a democratic society. But you know, you really can't have it both ways. You spend most of your adult life at work, 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day. Even the days you're not working, the hours of the day you're not working, you're getting prepared. You're getting dressed and brushing your teeth, or you're getting on the subway or the bus and you're coming home. Work is your adult life. If you believe in democracy, then the first place it should have been instituted is at work. But you live in a society which has never democratized the workplace. It is no more democratic today than it was 100, 200, or 300 years ago. How you square that as an American with your commitment to democracy is a mystery. How you can justify going abroad and dropping bombs on people to bring them a democracy we don't even have is even more amazing. It shows you what the human mind is capable of when needing to believe something, no matter how much evidence is screaming to the opposite effect. So we don't have democratic enterprises. Capitalism isn't organized that way. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about a different way of organizing an enterprise, a way that is democratic, that actually embodies the values of democracy. And before I jump into what it looks like, let me remind you that the effort to create democratic work is not new. It has existed for as long as the human race has existed. People thousands of years ago put together enterprises that were run democratically. Some of them lasted for centuries. So this is not new. What I'm about to describe to you is not some utopian fantasy of what we might do in some charming future. It is actually learning from our own past to take directions that we could have taken in the past, that some did take in the past, and that are now necessary to recoup in a new setting with new conditions and to make use of what the human race has in fact learned. So, what would a democratic enterprise be? It's not at hard, difficult for me to explain this. I'm just using the examples. Here we go. All the decisions made by the board of directors in a modern corporation still have to be made. What are we going to produce in this workplace? How are we going to do it? Where exactly is the production going to happen? And what is done with the profits? Those decisions still have to be made. But in a democratic workplace, it's done one person, one vote. Real simple. Everybody. The supervisor, the assembly line worker, the janitor, the security guard, the secretary, the clerk. One person, one vote. They all have to live with the results of what is done in the enterprise. They all participate in making it a democratic enterprise. If we had more time now, I would stop speaking and I'd play the national anthem, just to get everybody in the mood. A democratic enterprise. How hard is this? It's not hard at all. It's how it could work. And by the way, some of you may think right away, oh, you couldn't do it that way. Let me remind you of something historically. Once upon a time, it was thought among reasonable people just like you and me that there had to be a king. The king knew everything and was very smart, and in many cultures, the king had daily conversations with God or whoever you thought was a deity. And therefore, we all had to do what the king told us to do because he was the king. And if you did away with the king, it would be like doing away with your own head. Your body would get all crazy and fall over, and that would be the end of you. Do away with the king was the end of civilization. And then, I don't have the time to do the history its justice, but then a day came where people got kind of angry, and they separated a lot of kings' heads from the rest of their bodies. Wasn't pleasant, but it did have the following amazing consequence. Civilization didn't collapse, history didn't stop, the sky didn't fall, and we got rid of kings, and we replaced them with a much more democratic arrangement where everybody got to have some say, sort of, in what's going on. Well, where did it come from that you believe that a business has to be run by a king or a group of kingly type people, or at least a group of people who act like they were kings? Why? Where does this belief come from? Strange. Suppose you democratized the enterprise. Suppose you made it a democratic decision. I'm going to now describe to you what might have happened over the last 40 years in America if we had had an economic system in which enterprises were democratic. Let's go. Let's do it. Let's start with the question, where production is going to happen. That's a decision. Where is it going to happen? Over the last 40 years, we know where capitalists have made that decision. For those of you not aware, capitalists decided in the 1970s, and we can go into this in the Q&A that comes later, but in the 1970s, capitalists in America decided to leave the United States. They've been abandoning the United States for 40 years. You all know that because you live in an area from which they left. I just spent yesterday in Syracuse. That is so obvious, it's kind of painful. Half the downtown is an empty lot. That's a hint. They left. They left. That's why all of you now, if you look at the labels on your shirts and your underpants and your socks, you know it's made somewhere else, somewhere very far away. China, the big one, or India, or Brazil, or Bangladesh. And you know why that decision was made. The wages there are much less. It's not complicated, folks. Businesses, capitalist business, had a kind of moment in the 1970s when they realized, why in the world are we paying these high wages in the United States when we could get people in China to work for a small fraction of that? And they looked at it and they decided it was good and they left. And they've been leaving ever since. Now, suppose the decision hadn't been made by capitalists maximizing profit. Suppose in every factory the question was given to the workers democratically to decide whether we're leaving, closing the factory and moving to Shanghai. This is going to come as a shock to you, but had the workers decided that democratically, they wouldn't have left, would they? Would they have canceled their own jobs? Not likely. Would they have packed up and moved to Shanghai? Less likely. And that means the jobs, wow, would have stayed here. And the revenue paid to the cities would have stayed here. And the whole history of the United States would have been radically different because we had democratic decisions which would have never voted to abandon themselves to what has happened in this country, to city after city, to region after region for 40 years. Imagine that would have made it impossible for there to be a Donald Trump complaining about all of that, denouncing all of that. I mean, Syracuse was bad, but if you want to see the real example, then you have to go to Detroit. Detroit is the unbelievable example. Let me remind you of the history. It's 1970. Detroit is the most successful capitalist city in the world. The President of the United States brings foreign visitors when they visit the United States to Detroit. 2 million people, that's the population in 1970. 2 million, keep it in your head, 2 million. It is wonderfully successful. The jobs that auto workers are getting are high-paid jobs. That's the American middle class. So successful is it that it's the most successful union in the country, the United Auto Workers, UAW, which has its base there. Even more successful, African Americans are given jobs. They're not given jobs very well in this country for the previous 150 years before that anywhere else. They get good auto jobs so that you can show it as a showcase for integration. That's stretching the matter a bit, but there's at least some black workers with a decent salary, able to send their kids to school, etc., etc. So you could showcase it. So successful was it that the African American community contributed out of Detroit a whole new music to world culture called the Motown Sound. Amazing what was done. Now let's go fast forward. That was 1970. So the last 40 years, where is Detroit today? Detroit is currently in bankruptcy as a city. It's the largest urban bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The population of Detroit today, 700,000 people. What does that mean? that the majority of people in Detroit were driven out of their homes, their schools, their churches, their neighborhoods, their kinship systems. Many of them going to other cities like Cleveland or Camden, New Jersey, where it happened to them again. Detroit became famous 6 months ago when, in their bankruptcy, in the absence of jobs, when there were half the houses are abandoned, when people left town. It turned out that a lot of the people who left Detroit couldn't pay anymore for Fido, the dog. And so in a tearful farewell, as they're driving out of Detroit, leaving it forever, they open the door and they push Fido kind of out, tearfully. And Fido goes trotting off, but Fido has a place to live. Thousands of abandoned houses. So Fido goes there, and Fida goes there too. And there Fido and Fida do something which I can't discuss. And the result is many more dogs. Meanwhile, the city in bankruptcy lays off the dog wardens. Those are the people whose job it is to collect the dogs without licenses. You know the story? Well, if you have a lot of dogs and no dog wardens, Detroit began to have a wild dog problem. The dogs began attacking children. Wow. In 30 years, from the great model of a successful capitalism to an urban area bedeviled by wild dogs. You couldn't make this up. Now, what happened here? Here we go. Three. The boards of directors of three companies, you know them well, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. They decided, bye-bye, United States. We can make more money making cars in Mexico or Canada or now China. We're gone. And in a delicate moment, they turned to the American people, you and me, and said, goodbye, screw you. And they left behind the collapse. Amazing. You think the workers, if they had democratically owned and operated Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, would have voted for this to happen? Never would have happened. Never. Let's take another example. The decision about how you do production, what technology to use. Suppose a technology is invented that will allow you to make more of whatever it is you're making, but only by using machines that pollute the air or pollute the water or make too much noise. Well, if you're a board of directors, you say, whoa, we can make a lot more profit, so we're going to install that, and workers who don't want that, they can go get another job. After all, we're on the board. We live in a gated community 42 miles away. This is not our problem. And we'll make more money. So they will install the bad technology. But now suppose the workers themselves made the decision. On the one hand, they'd say, well, we could make more profit. That's attractive. But on the other hand, we and our husbands and our wives and our children and our neighbor, we're going to breathe that bad air. We're going to drink that bad water. That's going to affect our health. We're not going to make that decision. We're not going to make that decision anywhere near as often in favor of profit at the expense of the environment that those capitalists, that board of directors, has been doing. You want to do something about ecological breakdown, change the way that decisions are made and who makes them. Let me give you another example. This is going to come as a major shock to you. I'm trying to be ironic here. Okay? Here comes. At the end of the year, in every corporation, there's the following moment. Some of you have been subjected to this. It's the Christmas party. And the CEO, the big cheese of your company, gets up on wobbly legs on an even more wobbly chair because he's drunk too much. And he gives the following speech with his slurred tongue. I want to thank you all, he says, for a wonderful year. You all worked hard and you all contributed to the record profits we've earned. And then he falls down. Okay? And you go on drinking because you weren't interested anyway. And you know that it's all empty words. Why do you know? Because the next day, that same official is going to get together with the other dozen members of the board of directors, and they're going to decide what to do with the profits. The profits you help to produce will be determined as to what is done with them by somebody other than you. And now here comes the biggest shock of all. The board of directors, who are selected by the major shareholders, when it comes to deciding what to do with the profits you all have helped them produce, decide to give the lion's share of those profits, this is going to be the shock now, to themselves. That's what they do. A portion is parceled out as dividends. That's money sent to the shareholders. But they're the shareholders. Another big part is given in huge pay packages to the CEO. Who's on the board of directors? You guessed it, the CEO. They give it to themselves. Over the last 40 years, they have been doing that to beat the band. And that's why we have the inequality we do in this society. Our inequality doesn't come from overpaid athletes or actors and actresses. That's this. The big part of our inequality is how we organize the distribution of profits. We, the working class, our job is to make the profits. They, the boards of directors, decide what is done with them, and to nobody's surprise, they give the lion's share to themselves. Now imagine a worker co-op in which the workers together would decide what to be done with the profits they together have produced. You think they would give some people $50 million pay packages while every worker has to borrow money to send their kid to college? Never happen. They would distribute it. They wouldn't give everybody the same, but they'd never distribute it in the unequal way that we see now. You want to do something about inequality? Change the organization of the enterprise. Because every other effort we've made as a nation for 100 years has failed. We have progressive income taxes. We have earned income tax credits. We have welfare we have done lots of things to redistribute wealth. Guess what? They haven't worked. And maybe we shouldn't be tearing ourselves apart as a country about redistribution. You know, think about redistribution this way. If you have two little children in your family, I have 2 kids myself, when they were little, did we buy one ice cream cone with 6 scoops for one kid and another ice cream cone with half a scoop for the other one, and then start struggling about redistribution? Take a few scoops from one and give it. No, that would have caused even worse trouble than we already had. No, better than redistribution fights, the better move would be not to distribute it unequally in the first place. That's not difficult. Our problem in our society is we're tearing each other apart about redistributing what we shouldn't have distributed so unequally in the first place. It's cheaper, it's less troublesome, it's less conflict-ridden to do it right at first. And you know how you do that? By democratizing the enterprise. Because if the whole community together of working people distributed it, they'd never distributed it as unequally as capitalism has done. Wow. A democratic workplace would have meant we didn't abandon America by capitalists going abroad to make more money. We wouldn't have the ecological disaster that we live in, and we wouldn't have the inequality that we live with. Major differences in our economic history, in the condition we would all have now, would have happened. And here's one more. We live in a society that is fundamentally inefficient. Capitalism, which loves to tell the story of its efficiency, rather like it loves to tell the story of our democracy. One closer look, it all dissolves as the mirage it is. We currently today, depending on how you count, have between 8 and 15 million unemployed people. Folks, that's not efficient. Those people are sitting there not working. You know what they want? They want to work, but they don't work. Meanwhile, according to the Federal Reserve Bank, which keeps the records, 20% of the tools, equipment, and raw materials needed in this country to produce are sitting idle, gathering rust and dust. 20%. If we took the 8 to 15 million people who want to work and put them together with all the tools, equipment, and raw materials they need to work with, we would have extra wealth produced in this country in the trillions of dollars. A system that can't put together the people who want work with all the tools and equipment that they need to work to produce the wealth that might solve the problems of Detroit and many other things. That's a society that screams inefficient. And why? Why aren't those people working? Because in our capitalist system, the only way those people get a job is if somewhere some capitalist thinks he or she can make a profit by hiring them. And as long as the capitalists don't see money in it, they don't hire them. And we sit there with our heads in our hands, but there's no technical problem here. We could in 20 minutes here make a list of useful things that people could be doing in our communities, give them a job, have them do it. When I speak in New York City, I remind everyone that we have one of the great distinctions in having the filthiest subway system on the planet. And what about jobs to deal with that? Millions of people have to live in those subways every day. Do something, and you can all make up the lists. Daycare centers, elderly programs for people. I mean, we have enormous social needs. And we have the people who want to work, and we have all the materials. But we have a capitalist system that can't put together the people with the materials to produce what we all know we need and want. That's an economic system that has no right to exist. It's a failure. And no matter how you dance around it, it's a failure. And a democratic alternative is a way forward. Now let me take it the next step. Let me try to show you how and why democratizing enterprises is a solution not only for a capitalism that doesn't work, but it's also for a solution for the alternative of the last 100 years, socialism, that didn't work out real well in China and Russia either. Let's see, it's different. How did that work? Well, let's go back. 1917 is the revolution in Russia. 1949, the revolution in China. Russia's the biggest country by geography on this planet. China's the biggest country by population. Should have been a lesson to all of us that these two biggest countries would go in that direction, would overthrow capitalism and institute a socialism. And what did they mean by socialism? Very simple. Their idea was simple. The problem with capitalism, they thought, was privately owned factories, offices, and stores. And they would have the government come in and take it over. And they also thought that the market is not a successful institution for distributing goods and services. And they had a simple argument. The market always distributes goods and services to those who are most able to pay. The market doesn't ask, how did you get to be the most able to pay? Do you have the most money because, say, you stole it? You notice the storekeeper does not inquire where you got the money when you go in there to buy something. The storekeeper is interested in selling it at the highest price and not interested in inquiring how you got it. Markets distribute scarce goods to the people who have the most money. That's why they're the big supporters of markets. Socialists never liked markets, so they substituted government planning. So the Soviet Union overthrew capitalism, turned over the industries from private owners to the government, and turned over the market, the distribution effects of the market, to the government that would decide who would get what. So the Soviet government decided how to distribute goods and services. I assume you all know that the United States, when it was in trouble, made the same decision. It suspended the market and distributed by government planning. And I can tell from your faces, you may not be up on your own history. During World War II, the United States had a problem. In order to fight World War II, the United States had to mobilize its resources. to equip the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and so on, to fight against the Germans in Europe and the Japanese in Asia. And that meant lots of resources in America had to be shifted over for the war effort, to build the tanks and the planes and the ammunition and the uniforms. And that meant much less was available for the civilian population. Now they had a choice. They could let the market do its work. But what would that have meant if sugar was scarce, if meat was scarce, if gasoline was scarce? And these were all the kinds of things that were scarce then because they were being used for the war effort. If they had let the market do its work, the price of those would have gone very high. And the only persons who could have bought sugar and milk and meat and gas would have been the rich. And the decision was made by Republicans and Democrats alike. Let me do that again. Republicans and Democrats alike in Washington was, we can't do that. Because if the mass of the American people see that the scarce goods that everybody needs are only going to the richest people, they're going to get angry. So we have to dispense with the market. Whoa, how did they do that? They issued something called ration cards. For those of you who have elderly folks who are still around the Second World War, ask them. They'll tell you all about it. You went to the store to get a quart of milk, money wouldn't have done the job for you. You had to have a ticket, a ration ticket issued by the government. Otherwise, the storekeeper could not give you the quart of milk, and if he or she did, they would be arrested. It's a crime. And how did the government distribute the ration cards? Get ready, folks. Here we go. They were distributed according to people's needs. Does that sound familiar to some of you? Distribution according to need, not according to your market capacity to pay. Oh, goodness, that's what the socialists were always talking about. And we did that here in America, didn't we? And if you forgot about it, or if you didn't know, that's a clue to a problem with your education. Okay? So traditional socialists in Russia and China nationalized the industries and substituted planning for markets. Now, they accomplished a number of things. I don't want to be seen as some, Monday morning quarterback with criticisms. I'm going to make a huge criticism in a minute, but before I do, to keep the balance, because in America that's important. The Soviet Union and China are the most successful examples of economic growth in a short period of time that exist in human history. They put the economic growth of any capitalist country to shame by comparison. Russia went from the worst, most backward country in 1917 on the eve of the revolution to become a second superpower after the United States by 1970. They did that starting off as the poorest country in Europe and having, let's count them, losing World War I doesn't help your economic growth, followed by a revolution, doesn't help your economic growth, followed by a civil war, doesn't help your economic growth, followed by World War II, doesn't help your economic growth, and nonetheless, by 1975, they're the second superpower after the United States. That's a record of economic growth that finds no equal with one exception. And what's the exception? The People's Republic of China, which over the last 25 years, and I'm sorry if again this is new news for you, but that's another one of those hints about your education. Over the last 25 years, the United Nations keeps a record. How fast our economy is growing. And over the last 25 years, one country is always number one. It's the People's Republic of China, which is now the number 2 economic power in the world after the United States. They were even further behind than the Russians were in 1917. For those of you not aware, and I can tell from your faces that there's at least a few of you, there's an easy way and a very pleasurable way. A wonderful American novelist named Pearl Buck wrote a famous book called The Good Earth years ago about China in the 1940s. Read it. You'll get a better grasp of the level of poverty that was in China. To believe now that they're the second is an achievement of economic growth, again, without parallel. So economic growth they got. Socialism they didn't get. The inequality in China today is as bad as it is anywhere in the world. The ecological damage that they have done to their societies, enormous. So they paid a heavy price. Could it have been different? Well, now let's see. I think so. I think they might have had a very different history, like we would have had they taken the step of democratizing the enterprise, which they never did. Basically, what happened in the Soviet Union and China was this. You got rid of the board of directors elected by the shareholders. You did that by getting rid of the shareholders. One of the first things Lenin did in the revolution in Russia was to close the stock market. No need for one. The government is taking over. You're not going to be trading your ownership because you don't have any ownership. He made a famous speech in which he invited the people who had shares of stock to tear them into little strips and to put them in the bathroom for another purpose. Okay? Not very nice, but he got the message across. So in every industry in Russia and China, to this day, you got rid of the private board of directors, but you got another board composed of government officials, commissars, commissioners. The government took over. It thought that was socialism. It thought it was about changing ownership and planning and markets. It never dawned on them, no. You want to have a successful socialism, you got to change the society at the base. Otherwise, the same antipathy, resentment, bitterness that workers have for their boss in capitalism, they will develop for their commissars sitting at the top of their state enterprises. And true enough, that's what happened. So the lesson being learned in the socialist world is precisely that our socialism of the past was focused at the top of society and not at the base. Had you put the people in charge of the enterprises, they would have had the wealth in their hands without which the state can't do anything anyway. That would have given a democratic control from below, which is what state socialisms so badly lacked. So it turns out the democratization of the enterprise is becoming a new direction for socialists, even as in our society, coming out of a capitalist history, much the same goal is emerging as a dominant interest. For those of you who don't know, Cuba, one of the continuing parts of the old Soviet world, is now focusing on a mammoth redirection of its economic development around worker co-ops. Wow. And in the United States and in Western Europe, co-ops are also growing. And they're very successful. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. In Italy in 1985, a law was passed called the Marcora Law. Very important law. Let me tell you about it. And again, if you didn't know about it, well, it has another hint about your education. See, the law was passed in 1985. It's still on the books. And here's what it does in Italy. If you become unemployed, you have two options. Option one, you get a weekly check, just like we do here in America. You get it for a longer period of time, but you get a weekly check. Europeans call that the dole. Not so nice. Nothing to do with pineapple. It's the dole. It's like our unemployment check. But you have a second choice. The Italian government says, if you want, we'll give you an alternative. You don't have to come every week and get a check. We'll give you the entire year or year and a half worth of unemployment checks you're entitled to as a lump sum right now. Whoa, that's a lot of money. And there are two conditions. Condition number one, you have to find at least 9 other unemployed people to make the same decision with you. 10 or more is the minimum. And if those other 9 do, they get their unemployment lump sum right now too. And the second condition, you're going to love this, the second condition is you have to use that money, the lump sum, as the startup capital for a worker co-op. If you do those two things, you get the lump sum. There are more co-ops, worker co-ops in Italy than any other European country. No mystery at all. Turns out lots of workers would rather do that than go every week while they're losing their connection to their employer and they're losing their skills and they're feeling terrible about themselves and they're having trouble with their wife or husband, blah, blah, blah. All the things we know happen from unemployment. All of those are evaded, and instead you get to start a whole new life with an enterprise you own and operate. Wow, what an interesting idea. It's important that here in America, this interesting idea is completely off the radar. Nobody says nothing about it, and your faces give away that you never heard about it before. How interesting. Other example will be the most famous and most successful worker co-op in the world today. It's called the Mondragon Corporation, M-O-N-D-R-A-G-O-N, Mondragon. So a very brief story about it. It was started in 1956 by a Roman Catholic priest in the north of Italy, in the north of Spain, in the region called the Basque region. It's a special group of people. They have their own language. They've lived there for centuries. It's in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate France from Spain. And this Catholic priest said to his parishioners there, very poor part of Spain, if we wait for capitalist employers to come in here and give us a job, we will all die of old age before it happens. Ha, ha, ha. So here's what we need to do. We need to become our own employers, then we don't have to wait. So he sets up the first worker co-op, a place where the workers who do the work are also their own board of directors. He starts in 1956, 6 workers and the priest. Very interesting. The church kind of provides the Roman Catholic Church provides a certain protection for this new thing to develop. Fast forward to today. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, and by the way, you can Google that and learn all about it if you'd like, now has something on the order of 100,000 workers. It is the 8th or 9th largest corporation in all of Spain. Over those years, it has competed. It's actually a family of about 150, 200 co-ops together within this one corporation. They have competed with countless capitalist enterprises producing the same things, and they've outcompeted them. So for those of you that are worried that a co-op can't be competitively successful against a capitalist enterprise, Mondragon is a 50-year example of why you're wrong. Very successful. Here's some rules that might strike you as interesting. In the Mondragon co-op, of course, it being a democratically run set of enterprises, it is, now this is going to be difficult for some of you as Americans, so get ready. In this arrangement, the workers hire the managers. I'm going to do that again. The workers hire them. At the end of each year, the workers assess how good the managers were. And if they were good, they're kept. And if they weren't, they're fired. The workers fire the managers. You all understand that you live in a world that has it the other way round. Think about it, just for a while. And then decide which you'd prefer, dangerous as it is to pose such a question to yourself. Second interesting rule about Mondragon. They passed a rule which is in effect that the highest paid worker cannot get more than 8 times or 8.5 times what the lowest paid worker does. Gee, here in the United States, the typical CEO gets 300 times what the lowest paid worker in his or her company get. You want to do something about inequality? Make a co-op. Mondragon solved the problem decades ago. Oh. Now let's see. They have their own bank, so they don't have to go to outside their Mondragon. Every cooperative has to put a part of the money in the bank so that the money is available for any other co-op that may need it for a while. They have their own university. I've been there. They run classes. Anyone want to learn how to organize a co-op? They teach you. You want to learn how to finance a co-op? They teach you. You want to learn how to coordinate among co-ops? They teach you. They've been teaching you for a long time. They have a core of professors and a very highfalutin, high-tech university thing. I've been there. I've given talks there too. So I've seen it. Wow. They have their own labs to develop new technology and new products. So successful are their labs that 2 American corporations pay Mondragon so that their scientists can work alongside the Mondragon scientists in the Mondragon labs so that these 2 American corporations can get the benefit of the research that they're doing. And I thought you might be interested, just as a sign of how these things might work, in the names of the 2 corporations in America that pay money to this worker co-op organized so differently from themselves: General Motors and Microsoft. You get it? You may not know about worker co-ops, but the people who are making sure you don't know about it are busy working with them. Who's the fool here? Who? What is it we are permitting to happen to ourselves? Now, my last point. What about worker co-ops as a focus for a new political movement to bring change? Whether it's here in the United States and capitalist countries like ours, or places like the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, and so on. I think the prospects are stunning, attractive, powerful, and I want to make the case. But before I do, I want to tell you about 2 political leaders in the English-speaking world who are already moving in that direction. One, a little, and the other one, a lot. Who's the one with a little? Bernie Sanders. If you look at his economic program, down 2/3 of the way down on his list is we should do more with worker co-ops and other kinds of co-ops. Okay, at least one candidate, I believe he's the only one, even has it somewhere in the purview of what he might do were he to be elected. But it's very vague and it's very minimal. But let's cross the ocean to Great Britain, to England. There, a politician has gone much further. The name, in case you don't know it, Jeremy Corbyn. He's the new leader of the British Labour Party. He is as amazing as a new leader as Mr. Sanders is as a new kind of candidate on the scene of politics in the United States. Jeremy Corbyn is sort of like Bernie Sanders here. Only what he did is run for the head of the second most important political party in Great Britain, the Labour Party, to transform it utterly from what it was under the leadership of Mr. Tony Blair to what it is now or is becoming under the leadership of Mr. Jeremy Corbyn. And Mr. Corbyn has a platform about worker co-ops. He has a commitment to make worker co-ops a major, get ready now, a major segment of the British economy, so that alongside the capitalist sector, businesses organized with a board of directors and major shareholders and shares and all of that, there will be now a second sector, the cooperative sector, so that customers, when you want to go out and buy something, you know, a hamburger or a shirt or a haircut, you can either buy it from a top-down, hierarchical, undemocratic capitalist enterprise, or, if you so prefer, you will finally have freedom of choice. Americans tend to like that. You can buy a hamburger or a shirt or whatever from a co-op. In fact, it will become the law, maybe, that on the back of the shirt, it won't say anymore what country it came from, but it will instead say, this comes from a nasty capitalist enterprise or a charming, lovable co-op. You can do away with the adjectives, but you get the idea. We would have a choice. You know the way we already do now with fair-traded coffee and things like that? You can pay a few cents more for a pound of coffee and have at least the belief, hopefully not illusory, that the peasant who made the coffee is being treated less exploitatively than is the norm. Well, now you would choose between having your dollar not only buy you a shirt, but be a kind of vote in favor of one kind of economic system versus another. That would give you real choices, which you don't now have in the land of free choice. Even better, Young people entering the labor force would have a new choice that they don't have now. You can go to work in a top-down capitalist enterprise, being the useful drone who arrives each day at 8 o'clock and sent to the cubicle where you're to spend your lonely hours before happy hour. Or you can work in a co-op where you will be part of the leadership and the ownership of the enterprise, not just a worker within it. Workers would then have a choice, but in order to have that choice, there has to be a sector that is cooperative. And Mr. Corbyn is in favor of that. And he has a plan which he says will become law in England if and when he's elected to replace David Cameron, the current leader in England. And David Cameron is now looking much closer to departing than he did 2 weeks ago, because it turns out he has personally benefited from Panamanian shell companies. How unfortunate for him. Here's what Mr. Corbyn's plan is. It's part of the Labour Party program. Businesses can start as they always have in England. A creative businessman or woman can start an enterprise and put it together in all the usual ways. Fine. And for as long as that originator, that entrepreneur, maintains his or her relationship to the business, they can run it the way they do now. But the minute that entrepreneur either dies, decides to do something else in his or her life, decides to sell the business, or decides to go public in the sense of selling share, becoming a share company. When any of those things happen, something intervenes. The government intervenes, and the law requires such an entrepreneur to give the right of first refusal to the workers in the enterprise to transform it into a worker cooperative, which the government will facilitate and finance. Oh, goodness. That's gonna create that sector. You know how I know that'll happen? Because I already, with the organization I work with, Democracy at Work, what a strange name, Democracy at Work, we are already now receiving, through the radio program that some of you hear that I do and other mechanisms we have, we're being deluged now. Deluge, we have the dozen. Dozen for us is a deluge. Of the following. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, we'll call them, in Ypsilanti, Michigan. They've spent a life building a business. They started from nothing when they were young people. And now it's got 79 employees. They're very proud. But their children don't want to continue this business, and they want to now retire. They've done enough. What are their options? Option number one, they can close the business. They don't want to do that. They just put their whole lives into this. They don't want to, and they feel terrible. They don't want to deprive all those people whom they know personally of the jobs, let alone the community that has nurtured them and given them all kinds of help to become a successful business, as all successful businesses have had help from their communities. And they don't want to do the other either. They don't want to sell it to a big corporation, because who knows what the big corporation is going to do the day after the sale is closed. Do they maybe really just want the patent, or they just want the real estate, or they have a whole crew of people they're going to bring in instead? I mean, they don't want that either. And then someone says to them, or they hear us on the radio, there's another option. Come to talk to us. We have the lawyers and the accountants who will figure out with you how to sell the business to your own employees as they become a workers' co-op. It's done all the time in the United States. For those of you not aware, the laws already make all of that perfectly possible and often profitable for the seller. Wow. So I know that's going to happen in England. I know Mr. Corbyn is absolutely right. And for those of you, because I can see from some of your faces, who might say, gee, well, that's sort of counting a lot on the government to help out. My answer is, you betcha. I like to quote Sarah Palin every chance I get. You betcha. You betcha. And you know why there's a good precedent for the government helping co-op businesses? Because the government has been helping capitalist businesses in this country for 300 years. Every day, if you read your newspaper right, you'll see one or another authority of the New York State helping the utility company over here and the car company over there and the relocating business over here, and there's a tax break over there and there's a subsidy over there, and these curriculum of these high school students is being adjusted so that they get the kind of training that will make them useful to the employer in the neighborhood, blah, blah. It would take me 10 minutes to show you that every major sector of capitalism in this country has gotten enormous subsidies paid for by taxpayers. If we had the power in this country, we would never let a corporation get up and leave without paying back all it has gotten over the years from the people it has gotten benefits from. And if they had to do that, they wouldn't leave because they couldn't afford it. By the way, other countries do that. When the German government helped bail out Opel, a division of General Motors, they gave them bailout money, but on condition that when they got out of the problem, they had to pay back a good chunk of the bailout money. The American government bailed out the parent, General Motors, and required them to do what when they got back on their feet? Nothing. Nothing. That's because we live in a democracy. And once again, if I had more time, I would stop and I would play you again the national anthem. But we don't have the time, so I won't. So I believe in the United States we could be, as I believe Corbyn is becoming in England, a very powerful and very influential force. And that the worker co-op is a way to do that. Over the last half century, everything anti-capitalist or non-capitalist has been demonized in the United States. You all know that, even if you never heard it said in so many words. Since the late 1940s, anyone having anything to do with socialism, communism, Marxism, anarchism, and all the rest has been treated as though you are either ignorant beyond all words, or malevolent, or the agent of a foreign power to be avoided like bad diseases are. And so, of course, here in the United States, this settled into the popular consciousness. There's no mystery, I assume, that you all know American history as to why this happened. It's because in the 1930s, when we had a collapse like we've had since 2008, we had a very different American response. We had the greatest labor organizing drive in American history. From 1933 to 1938, millions of people joined unions who had never done it before, whose parents had never been in a union. It was the most successful union drive in American history. Never had anything like it before, never had anything like it since. And it was aided and abetted by two socialist parties and a communist party, all of whom were very strong in the United States. And the coalition of communists, socialists, and the CIO, that was the name of the organization that mounted the drives, was so powerful that it went to the president in a time of depression, Mr. Roosevelt, and it said, look, Mr. Roosevelt, we voted you in. But if you don't do something for the mass of people as they're going through these hard times, we're not going to vote for you again, and you're going to lose. Mr. Roosevelt was a good politician. He heard what was being said to them, and he knew they weren't bluffing. If you look at the newspapers in the middle 30s, you would have seen workers marching down the streets of every American city every day, Syracuse included, and Rochester, and Buffalo, and Albany, and New York City, big time. He knew there was no bluff. So he went to the rich and the corporations and he said, hey, folks, I just had this meeting with the unions and the communists and the socialists. Oh my God, his friend said, are you all right? And we got through all that. He said, yeah, I'm fine, but I got bad news and good news for you. Here's the good news. They want to make a deal. And the deal is they want me to help the mass of people in a big way to get through this depression. The bad news is they're basically telling me if I don't do this, I won't get elected. But that's okay, you don't care about me that much. But there's more bad news. They're basically saying to me if I don't do something, there's going to be a revolution like they've already had in Russia. So I advise you, rich people and large corporations. By the way, Roosevelt knew them real well. He was one. He said, I advise you to help me here, because if you don't, you're not going to have any of this lovely wealth much longer, you guys. Half of them didn't buy the argument, didn't believe him, weren't bluffed. The other half said, oh my goodness. And they said, yes, that's all he needed. He went back to the unions, the communists and the socialists, and he said, okay, here's the deal. I will do more for you than you thought I was. But you got to stop talking about revolution, because that doesn't fly. You keep talking about revolution, the deal is off. But you shut up about that, and I can get these rich people. The unions were skeptical. The communists and the socialists were skeptical. But they were willing to make the deal. They did eventually make the deal. They said, where are you going to get the money? The government has no money. With millions of people unemployed, nobody's paying taxes, the government has no money. Roosevelt smiled. It's not the government's money we need. It's their money. And I explained to them, you're going to give me the money to take care of the mass of people, because if you don't, you won't have any money to give anybody. Deal done. Literally within weeks, Roosevelt goes on the radio and creates, let's remember, please, the history. He creates the Social Security system in America. Never before had we done that. He announces in the middle of a depression when there's no money, I'm going to give every person 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their lives, no matter how long they live. What? In the middle of a depression when there's no money? You're going to do what? Yes, billions. No sooner had he finished, he stands up and he says, I'm also establishing the unemployment compensation system. Every worker who's out of work for no fault of his or her own will get a check every week for a year. There were tens of millions of unemployed people at the moment he did that. That's going to cost a fortune. Yes, no problem. Then he passed the minimum wage so that everybody who has a job gets a minimum wage. That's when the minimum wage started in the United States. We'd never had Social Security, we'd never had unemployment compensation, we never had a minimum wage. But I left the best one to last. He goes on the radio and he says, if the private sector, courageous man, if the private sector cannot provide work to the millions of Americans who ask for nothing other than an opportunity to work, well, then it's obvious to me, I must do it. And between 1934 and 41, Roosevelt created and filled 15 million jobs. The cost to the government, spectacular. At the same time, Social Security, unemployment, and a government jobs program. And where did he get the money? He taxed corporations and the rich. Let me do that again. He taxed corporations and the rich a lot, a huge amount. So when someone today says to you, we can't tax corporations and the rich, the only answer is, of course we can, because we've been there and we've done that. And the world didn't end and nothing bad happened. In fact, we got through the Depression rather better than most other countries did, in part because we did those things. That was done because of the coalition of unions, socialists, and communists, which is why after World War II, they were repressed. The right wing and the business community knew who made that happen. It wasn't Roosevelt, it was the pressure from below. So you turned around after the war and you said communists are not the militants who organized the labor movement. No, they're agents from Moscow. You terrified the population and you killed that organization. When that was done, you went after the socialists. And that's why in America, most American students that I've had over 30 years of teaching believe that communist, socialist, Marxist, anarchist, terrorist, those are all synonyms. That's all the same thing. No one in Europe thinks that. Everyone in Europe understands what the differences among those are. But Americans, that's not because Americans are stupid. It's because we went through a period where we were told these are all the same evil. There are parts of America which add one more term to that. Communist, socialist, Marxist, terrorist, liberal. Or even other parts of America, Muslim. Why not? It's just a grab bag of badness. But we have to live with that legacy. Americans have been trained to be suspicious of government enterprises and government planning. But you know what? They've not been trained to be suspicious of democratically organized enterprises. It is a way to begin to mobilize a mass movement for change that does a nice end run around the training of Americans to be hostile, to be unsympathetic, to be hesitant. Asking for democracy to come into the enterprise sounds pretty good. It's very American, right up there with apple pie and baseball and picnics and other warm and cuddly things. It's a way of saying something that ought to exist, that you already believe in, can and should be now a vehicle for the changes you know need to be made. It is a rallying cry for a new social movement of progressive change. We've wanted it, we've needed it, we have to have that vision thing, we have to have that focus, and something that gathers people in a way they can believe in. A social change that is not about things that happen far away at the government, but right now, right here, every day, where you work, 5 out of those 7 days. Something that transforms your personal life along with the larger society. That's a recipe for social change. Let me conclude by sketching for you how it might look. We would have what traditionally the left has had: the labor movement, fighting against businesses from inside, asking for better conditions of wages and working conditions, and a political party that advocates those things, like the Labour Party in England or the socialist parties and communist parties in Europe, and like part of the Democratic Party in this country sometimes. But now we would add something, a very crucial new third dimension, a movement to establish and build networks of worker cooperatives. They would be the partner, the parallel track of the labor movement. They would allow unions, for example, to go to employers when the employers were threatening to leave and move to China and say to them, we don't want you to do that, but we're not going to grovel, we're not going to beg for you to stay here and give you back the benefits we fought so long to get, give you back the wages we desperately need. We're not going to do that. It's humiliating. It's, dare I say, un-American. So here's what we're going to do. Have a nice trip to China. Go. But we're going to let you in on something. The day you leave, we are going to take this factory and we're going to use it to become a workers' co-op. We're going to keep the jobs here. We're going to keep the factory running, the office running, the store running. We don't need you. And let's give you a little warning. We're going to run around America telling all the customers, you can buy from the company that left and went to China, that abandoned the United States, or you can buy from us, the workers' co-op that has replaced them. And you can preserve thereby American jobs, American communities, tax revenues for cities to function. And you'll want someone to do that for you someday, too. And where will the money come to make this transition possible? Well, I've done this now a couple times, and I tell you, one of the great pleasures. You sit down with a governor of a state here in the United States, and you say to him, this employer is threatening to leave, but we have a new strategy. Bye-bye, we said to him. We're going to take it over. So I've got a proposition for you, Mr. Governor. You're going to help us. You're going to use the law of eminent domain, which gives the community the right to buy property, and you're going to buy that factory and then sell it to the workers for a song. Something governments do all the time to developers. That's how your downtown mall got financed, 90% likely. So you're going to do that for us, Mr. Governor. And then you're going to give us subsidies, and you're going to give us a tax holiday, and then you're going to order from us for the government's usage, what we produce. And when you do that, Mr. Governor, we're going to run around the state, indeed the whole country, saying, you saved the jobs, you saved the community, you're a hero of working people, you will really get elected. And then there's the part I really like. And if you don't, Mr. Governor, you can kiss your political career bye-bye. I never have to say the second sentences. He hears me, he knows exactly where I'm going, not necessary. All he wants to know is, what do I have to do and when? Wow. That's only feasible if there's a partnership between labor and a movement to build co-ops. If you go back in the history of the American labor movement, 100 years ago, there were alliances between unions and co-ops. It's not a new thing either, but it could be now a new strategy. And then imagine a political party, my final point. Imagine a new political party, one whose base was working people in capitalist enterprises, the unions, but whose other base was the worker co-ops. This would be the base in terms of votes. It would be the base in terms of financing for such a party. And in exchange, the party would not just do things that were good for workers in a capitalist enterprises, but do things that were good for worker co-ops to grow, to give them the network of government help that capitalist enterprises have always counted on. Now we would have a new American politics in which one party had a new vision of a new society and the other one was stuck preserving what already existed that the majority of Americans already don't want. That's what Trump and Bernie are already showing us. Millions and millions of disaffected people who see that this economic system doesn't work. All of this is not abstract. My final 2 minutes. I work with this organization called Democracy at Work. We produce this radio program that was so kindly mentioned in the introduction. We are now on 52 stations around the country. We just added one this week in Alaska. That's why I have Sarah Palin in my head. I can't do the public speaking around the country that I'm invited to do. I can't physically manage it. Nobody could. It's overwhelming. I do a radio or television interview now at least once a day, 7 days a week, and I've been doing it for 4 years. There are days when I do 5 of them. Okay? Those of you who know programs like Tom Hartman and so on, I'm on there all the time. I've done interviews with Charlie Rose and Chris Hayes, Amy Goodman, Bill Maher. Flew me out to Los Angeles to talk with him about Marxism. His choice, not mine. At the end of February of this year, I'm just going to give you a smattering. At the end of February of this year, I was invited for the first time in my life to address the California Democratic Party at its annual convention, which this year was held the last weekend of February in San Jose, California. I arrived there and I am ushered into the Hilton Hotel, which is associated with the convention center. And then they put me up at the Hilton Hotel, and the California Democratic Party is well-heeled, as you might imagine. So I'm staying in the Hilton Hotel, and I come down to the convention center room where I am to speak, and I'm told by the leadership that I should be very proud. They have allocated to me 1 hour to speak, which is a very long time. And to drive home the point, they said, you will be preceded by the half an hour we have allocated to Joseph Biden. So he did speak a half an hour, and I spoke for an hour. I spoke in a room that has 600 seats. Every seat was taken. The walls were lined. People were sitting on the ground. They had invited me, by the way, this is the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party, which is the largest caucus in it. They invited me to speak about socialism. That was their choice, not mine. That's what they asked me to speak about. Try to think what it means in America when the Democratic Party of the largest state wants you to talk for an hour about socialism, and then, the weirdest thing of all, invites for the person to do that, me. I'm not sure, whatever that might mean, I'm not your average socialist. If you go to my website, you'll see this scary name, Marx all over the place. See, I've learned a lot from Mr. Marx and people like him. So it's really interesting that the California Democratic Party brought me in there. And when I finished, and I told them something not so different from what I've told you, they stood up and gave me a standing ovation. They were enthralled. Whether they agree with me or not, who knows? But wow. And then I'm going to end by telling you where I was 2 weeks ago. I went for the first time in my life, I've never been there, to the state of Kentucky. I was invited to the state of Kentucky. Shows you there's already something wrong there. And I spoke at something called the University of Northern Kentucky, and then I went, that's a suburb of Cincinnati. It's across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio. And then I went to Lexington, the capital. I spoke at the University of Kentucky. In both cases, auditoriums, 200, 250 people, all full. The enthusiasm, the excitement, it's electric. In my small way, I am experiencing what Bernie Sanders, in a large way, is also touching. There's something going on in the United States that is fundamentally different from anything I have seen in my lifetime. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, many years ago. Nothing like this has happened. I was active in the 60s. That's when I became sort of politically aware. This is way beyond all of that. For most of the last half century, it was probably fair for the left in America to say it's impossible to function here. The media against you, the politicians are against you, the academic world is against you, and we can't do much. We could have made that statement and there'd be a lot of truth to it. But it's not true now. Now, if there isn't the emergence of a left in America, it's on us. Because the chance now, the possibility now is enormous. Those millions of people that don't seem to be bothered by the fact that Bernie Sanders has the word socialist attached to him, they're telling us something. The people around the country that are inviting me to come and like what they hear are telling us something. We've got to listen. We have more than enough people. That's what Occupy Wall Street began to teach us, and that's what Bernie Sanders is making crystal clear. We have more than enough people to become a powerful source and movement for social change. It's up to us. And I can assure you, traveling around the country in a way that very few people have the chance to do, I can assure you that those people are there and they want to get active. That's what they want. More and more, they are saying to me, okay, we don't need you to explain it all, we get it. What are we going to do? What are we going to do is the next question. That's wonderful. That's the maturity of a movement. That's a movement that understands, and now that's great for us. But we have to answer. For most of the last 50 years, I've been a professor at American universities. Most of what I've said to you today, I could not say. When I got close to it, I had to dance in elaborate word games to allow bits of it to get through to an American population that was terrified of all the words. None of that is necessary now. I have come out of the margins of what's allowable in American public life and American academic life, and now I find myself in the center. Now, to be honest with you, and to invite you for yet another reason to become active, let me tell you, I'm having the time of my life. Thank you very much.
Hi, friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Bill Houston podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you appreciate my work and if you enjoy my work, I would appreciate if you could make a donation in any amount, $10, $20, even $100 if you can. No amount is too large or small. You can get there by going to tinyurl.com/donate to Bill Houston. That's tinyurl.com/donate, Bill Houston, HUSTON. And by the way, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And when you do, don't forget to click that little bell, and that way you'll be sure to get a notification whenever I post a new video. Thanks a lot. See you next time.